I think what we're seeing in China right now is an incredible amount of innovation and disruption in the financial industry. Digital currencies being one aspect of that. If you look at what's happening as a whole, you have the regulators that are gradually loosening regulations in the industry. So if we look just at capital markets, if you look at what's happened over the past couple of years, we see stock options, we see financial futures, we see margin trading, short selling, a number of different openings that the regulators have opened up in the market as they gradually liberalize things. At the same time, they're pushing financial technology. So when you look at things like personal credit ratings in China, the government has pushed companies like Alibaba and Tencent to get involved with that because the amount of data that they have. Digital currencies definitely have a role within that. I think the innovations obviously that we've seen around Bitcoin and some of the similar currencies have a specific role to play. It's just a bit unclear about what their role is in China. If you look at the store of value, obviously the renminbi is a capital-controlled currency, so there are some people that might want to use Bitcoin to get their money out of China or to evade those capital controls, but it's a very small part. So really the question for Bitcoin in China and digital currencies in general is what is their role in this rapidly changing marketplace? The regulators' responses to any innovations in the financial industry have really been based on the benefits of those innovations for the industry. So if you look at something like peer-to-peer lending, the government has kind of tacitly allowed peer-to-peer lending to continue without being tightly regulated. Now we're starting to see regulations around that, but why did they let it go? Because to a certain extent, peer-to-peer lending legitimizes and brings a lot of the shadow lending online. And shadow lending and shadow banking has been a big problem for the government in the past. The challenge with Bitcoin is that it's an innovation that brings risk but doesn't bring much benefit. So peer-to-peer lending, certainly an innovation, but it brings benefit to the industry and it goes along with the regulators' plan for reform in the mainland of China. But if you look at Bitcoin, it is an innovation, but it actually brings more risk because it's more speculative. The way that Chinese investors had gotten involved with it and kind of created the bubbles towards the end of 2013. So the government wanted to distance that from the financial industry. So if you look at what they've done, they've essentially disconnected the banks from Bitcoin exchanges, which puts the element of risk kind of one step further away. Certainly, I think the regulators have a role to play in protecting consumers. I mean, overall their goal and their objective is to guide the economy and the overall development of China in a stable direction. So I think that's their first task, is to make sure that the economy continues to develop, and more specifically the financial industry, because the financial industry is the grease and the flow of money that enables everything else to happen in China. So I believe their primary responsibility is protecting the industry and protecting the development and reform of the industry. With Bitcoin, certainly for a certain subset of people, it is incredibly risky. If you look at somebody, we talked to some people for the research that I've done for the book that bought at roughly $1,000, the equivalent in renminbi, and now it's at about $250. So those people have lost a significant amount of money on that. I'm sure that consumer protection came into some of the government's decision, but I think the main emphasis was on, because the amount of Bitcoin that was actually being traded in China was very small. If you look at the kind of the market cap of all of the peer-to-peer lending platforms in China, it greatly exceeds the largest value of Bitcoin that was ever traded in China, that was ever exposed to Chinese investors. So I think when you're weighing these options up, you look at something like peer-to-peer lending, they have to be much more careful about how they regulate that industry as opposed to Bitcoin. Similarly with online payments, if you regulate Alipay out of existence, you're affecting millions of people. If you regulate Bitcoin out of existence, it's maybe thousands. The challenge for Bitcoin in general is usage, and that's really what's going to drive it. And I use the example of the mother test. When does Bitcoin become easier for my mother to use than her credit card? Why does she use a credit card when she goes to buy groceries? It's because it's easy. In the US, if it's under a certain amount, you can just swipe and go. Bitcoin exchanges, if you look at what's going across Bitcoin exchanges now, it's not really consumer usage. It tends to be more people that are trading, that are arbitraging, that are using program trading or margin trading to take advantage of market inefficiencies, because it's a relatively new market. Why don't people do that with Hong Kong exchange? Because it's a much more mature market. You look at the arbitrage opportunities when you have a more nascent market, it's much easier to make money off of that. So I think a lot of the volume that we're seeing, although this is just speculation on my part, is the volume that we're seeing on the Chinese exchanges is largely around arbitrage and kind of making money off speculation and investment. So I think from that nature, the Chinese exchanges are providing what's needed by the market. And until we get to that next level of consumer adoption, I don't think there's much more need for them to expand. The biggest challenge for Bitcoin in China is usage. And we need to find applications for Bitcoin that make it easier or cheaper than what's already there. The challenge in China is if you look at peer-to-peer payments, so if you look at sending money to somebody else, which is one of the primary functions of Bitcoin, you have platforms like Alipay. Alipay is incredibly easy to use. It connects into the bank account. You can send money to anybody else. You have WeChat, and now WeChat has payment functionality built into that. So sending money is quite easy. On the merchant side, the merchant fees that are paid in China are much lower than in other markets. So if you look at a Visa and MasterCard in the US or in Europe, you would expect to pay a discount rate of about 3 to 4% depending on the card. So that means if you sell 100 euros worth of goods, you only get back 97 euros as the merchant. Now, in markets like that, Bitcoin can be attractive because the merchant fee would be as low as, say, 1%. In China, the merchant fees can be anywhere from 0 for schools, hospitals, educational institutions, to 2% for a lot of other merchants. So the merchant fees are much lower. So the incentive for merchants to actually get on and accept Bitcoin is much lower. So on one side, you have the other options for consumers are quite robust in China already, with things like Alipay and WeChat platforms. And on the other side, the merchants, there's not a lot of compelling reasons for them to use Bitcoin right now. And those two coming together really are the challenge for Bitcoin adoption in China.